And today we're going to look at the history and politics of the sanctuary movement, the possibilities and limits of sanctuary city designations, and the current challenges facing immigrants and immigrant rights organizers, particularly with everything going on with DACA and SB 54. So I'll introduce all three of our panelists, and then they're going to have about 15 minutes each to present, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So first, on the left, Sean Dempsey is a Jesuit priest and assistant professor of history at Loyola and Marymount University. He's a Master of Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, and a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. His dissertation was titled The Politics of Dignity, Social Christianity and the Making of Global Los Angeles. And his research focuses on the historical and global intersections of religion, social thought, and urban politics in the 20th century United States. Anthony Yang works at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles, as a policy advocate, and leads the Immigrant Rights Project, working on issues of immigrant integration, immigration enforcement, and immigrant youth organizing. He has a BA in political science from UC Irvine, and he previously served on United We Dream's National Coordinating Committee. He is also a co-founder and a current core member of Uplift, an undocumented Asian and Pacific Islander youth-led organization in Los Angeles County. Michael Kaufman is Sullivan and Cromwell Access to Justice Senior Staff Attorney and the Deputy Director of Advocacy at the ACLU of Southern California. He specializes in immigrant rights and economic justice issues, and is currently working on several legal cases around immigrant detention, bond hearings, and street vending. He previously worked for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco, where he directed a project to empower and advance the rights of domestic workers in the Bay Area. And then finally, Mario Fuentes, a lead organizer at LA Voice, who is also a member of the panel. Unfortunately, he's experiencing transportation difficulties this morning. I told him if he can make the tail end to please join us. But we're going to proceed with the panel with our three panelists, and we're really honored to have them here today. So I will turn it over.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Talk a little bit about, as the historian of the group, I'm going to be talking about sanctuary movement past, obviously, in Los Angeles. And it's relatively recent history, so I'm very aware that some of you here may remember this history better than I've researched it. So correct me in the Q&A or let me know what I've missed. Unlike, I think, the contemporary movement for sanctuary cities, this original, so to speak, sanctuary movement in the 1980s was heavily dependent on sort of grassroots activism, especially among communities of faith, churches, synagogues, and other activists. Coming out of the faith community, not exclusively, of course, but it's a particular research interest of mine. And before I tell a little bit about that story of the sanctuary movement in the 1980s Los Angeles, I'd like to just kind of give you an idea of the different kind of scales, historical and really spatial and intellectual, that kind of came together to create and make the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. First is a larger scale, I think, of post-World War II thought and social activism. And this goes beyond religious institutions, but I'm just going to talk briefly about religious institutions. Religious institutions in the wake of World War II became very interested in the issue of refugees and displaced people. Some of you might know that the American Friends Service Committee won the Nobel Peace Prize shortly after World War II, specifically for their work with displaced persons in Europe and in other parts of the world as a result of the war. In turn, this became a real centerpiece of what I call kind of a religiously infused kind of dignitarian politics. Other historians, Sam Moyne back east most explicitly calls this an age of Christian human rights. I think it went beyond the Catholic and Protestant churches to encompass lots of different groups. But it's a human rights kind of discourse and activism that's inspired by this concern for the displaced, this concern for the refugee. So that's kind of a global scale. The second scale is sort of the scale of the borderlands, and in a way how the border, especially the U.S.-Mexican border, or the border between Latin America and the United States, kind of cut through Los Angeles at the time. Los Angeles was not the first or only city to have a strong sanctuary movement in the 1980s. San Antonio and Tucson were really pioneers in this. And in those places as well, it emerged, especially from Latino communities of faith, especially some of the Catholic parishes that were in the barrios of those cities. And lastly, I think the sanctuary movement of Los Angeles really comes out of the decade prior, the 1970s, where there was a pronounced emphasis on the neighborhood and on place-based activism. And I'll talk a little bit about how churches played a role in that sort of turn after the civil rights period to a kind of neighborhood-based activism. And the idea of sanctuary, the idea of, first of all, churches being sanctuaries and by extension, whole cities being sanctuaries, I think originates in this idea of the neighborhood as a site of social activism and justice work. And in a way, sanctuary city is a broadening of this neighborhood spatial concept. So those are the scales. Now, to the 1980s and what actually happened to make Los Angeles very briefly a sanctuary city, and I'll talk about why it was brief in the 1980s. So this debate that we're having now is not new, and in some ways is eerily reminiscent of what happened about 32 years ago here in the city. So the more immediate context for the 1980s sanctuary movement is the Reagan era, is the civil wars in places like El Salvador and Guatemala, the Reagan administration's involvement in supporting the right-wing dictatorships of those countries, and the influx of people that the civil violence in Central America was creating, and many of them arriving, hundreds of thousands of them, in fact, arriving here in Los Angeles. So, enter this figure. It's my only slide. Some of you might have known of him back in the day. Oh, it's gone. I just told me I have perfect timing. So this is Luis Olivares, who was a Catholic priest, and he was a kind of key figure. If there's one figure I want to highlight for you in kind of understanding the original sanctuary movement in LA, it would be him. Not because he was the only activist, but because his sort of biography illuminates a lot of what I just said in a more abstract way. Olivares was a Mexican-American priest. He was very active beginning in the late 1960s and into the 1970s in kind of leveraging, especially the Catholic Church's presence in Latino neighborhoods for social activism. So he's one of the founders of the United Neighborhood Organization in East LA. Throughout the 1970s, he does a lot to kind of build up community organizing, parish-based organizing in East LA. One of the first times he gets into the Los Angeles Times is in the early 1970s because he gathers people together to put pressure on insurance companies. Insurance companies were charging residents of East LA outrageous rates on their car insurance based on the neighborhood that they lived in. And he was able to successfully organize people to push back with, I believe, the state to rein in the insurance company. So as early as the 1970s, activists like Olivares are creating what would become sort of the infrastructure of sanctuary in a way. Kind of communities dedicated to social justice, many of them using community organizing principles of Alinsky and people like that. So that's some of the background of Olivares. So I'd just like to talk briefly about what role do these religious groups and churches and leaders play, and how does it eventually lead to Los Angeles briefly becoming a sanctuary city. So as I mentioned, Olivares had been active in the 1970s in community organizing. And very early on in the 1980s, he commits this parish here. This is La Placita Church, the oldest church, Catholic church, oldest church of any kind in Los Angeles, right in the plaza of Los Angeles. Very early on, as this Central American refugee crisis emerges, and keep in mind, church leaders are attuned to the refugee issue almost by nature at this point. He commits his parish very early on to providing services for these refugees to help smooth their transition to the country. He's one of the first in Los Angeles to invoke that term of sanctuary. He has a news conference in 1985 announcing that this La Placita Church, his church, would be a sanctuary, and he would invoke an even longer tradition of churches standing with the poor and the oppressed. Now, if you want to go way back, the idea of sanctuary goes back to the Middle Ages or even farther. I'm a 20th century historian, and I'd just like to throw out there that sanctuary was invoked during the Vietnam War by some churches as well for people resisting the draft. So I think there was both a macro and a level and a micro level to the invocation of sanctuary. This obviously the language of sanctuary then was explicitly religious, but I think it was also in this era, in this historical context, fundamentally political. It was a direct rebuke to the Reagan administration's policies of support for right-wing dictatorships in Central America that had led to this refugee crisis. And joining Olivares at that announcement were many of the refugees themselves, so he gave voice to the refugees at this press conference. And after he spoke, refugees themselves came up sharing harrowing stories about their experience explicitly of Central America, what it was like there, what the journey was like to Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, from the very beginning, this garnered the support of a lot of the religious leadership of the city. So among the religious leadership, this was not necessarily considered incredibly controversial. The Episcopal Bishop of Los Angeles, Oliver Garber, was there, who expressed his church's support for this initiative that was emerging out of a Catholic parish, and more broadly for this movement in general, that, as I said, was active in several cities at this point. So in 1985, through the action of both religious leaders and activists, secular and religious, the Los Angeles City Council actually does vote in favor of declaring Los Angeles a sanctuary. So it happened before. This was not quite as strong as current debates about what sanctuary cities mean. The original resolution basically was a resolution in which the city officially praised the work mostly of churches that were doing this. So it was sort of an endorsement of the sanctuary activity that was going on, and a promise not to deny services to refugees. And really the thrust of this original statement was to declare the city a place that welcomed refugees specifically, and can't be separated from the context of the Central American situation in this. Okay. So one of the key figures in passing that original resolution in 1985 was a young councilman at the time, Michael Wu, the first Asian American on the council, who's out in Pomona now, I think he was doing. And he declared that the sanctuary declaration was an important step in recognizing the rights of people with no political representation, and a statement, crucially, that Los Angeles was a city open to refugees. Okay. Now, like I said, this is a largely symbolic resolution. Activists and some of the religious leaders wanted the city to go farther. But as it turned out, for some people, even this relatively symbolic resolution was too much. And there's a pretty substantial pushback against both Wu and the whole city council for having passed this. So in early 1986, the resolution is basically reversed. It's reversed and explicitly takes out the language of sanctuary, which had become kind of a political and legal hot potato by early 1986. Mostly because, and this should sound familiar in our own political environment, Reagan administration officials had threatened to suspend funding to Los Angeles as a sanctuary city, and threatened all sorts of legal challenges to this designation of sanctuary, which had no definition in American law and was therefore susceptible, the Reagan administration thought, to challenge. So, I don't want to take up more time than I have. As the political crisis in Central America deepens, as some of you may know, the situation for these refugees grew quite dire. The government from El Salvador especially had sent groups up into Los Angeles to try to intimidate the refugees who had come. Olivares himself was threatened many times in this period in ways that may have had substance or may have been simply to intimidate. And eventually, I'll just put on a final note, eventually this sanctuary movement becomes, in religious terms, what you might call the more prophetic edge of the religious leadership's attitude towards immigration and to Los Angeles becoming a city of immigrants in this period. But it was also eventually intimately tied in 1986 with the church's efforts to help immigrants take advantage of the so-called Reagan-era amnesty program. Some of you might remember that in 1986, the administration and Congress comes up with a deal for amnesty, but they didn't provide many funds to actually process people. So a lot of the energy of these same churches by 1986 goes into not only sanctuary, but to help process people under this IRCA amnesty. And I'll just leave on why that was significant. Some of you might recall that IRCA amnesty explicitly excluded Central American refugees because it said that it only applied to people who had been here since 1982, I believe it was. So it was amnesty for, it primarily affected Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles, excluded Central American refugees, and I'm not sure if it was a conspiracy, but it sort of divided the energies of the activist community. Do you help the Mexican immigrants get citizenship under IRCA? Do you help the refugees from Central America? And eventually the sanctuary movement as such begins to sort of lose some of its energy in the 1980s, I think in part because of this kind of divide and conquer strategy. That's a very brief rundown of how Los Angeles was in 1985 a sanctuary city, but by 1986 was not. Thank you.
Okay, you want to repeat?
That was very informative sort of context there, and I think a lot of the things that Tom mentioned, I think are still things that we face every day in Los Angeles, and just being part of the efforts to really pass policies locally and statewide to create like what people usually refer to as sanctuary policies. As Tom mentioned, there isn't any legal definition to what a sanctuary policies or sanctuary cities are, but typically in the way that we talks about it or other people talks about it is to cooperate with law enforcement, with ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, which is the enforcement arm of the federal government. So there's different ways local law enforcement and ICE collaborate, whether it's through data sharing, whether it's through having an ICE agent in their office, or the actual ICE agent at a desk in a police station or the sheriff's station. So those are different ways we've seen this collaboration happen, as well as in terms of task force, where there would be special enforcement task force supposedly on national security, targeting particular group of people. But in most of the cases that we've seen, even here in LA County, there wasn't actually the allegation, the original intent of the allegation wasn't there. Like, no one was a national threat. It was people who were just at a party, who are documented, and they are caught up in the speed. So I think these are the things that we in Los Angeles continue to face. And I think it's important for us to be bold about our leadership, be bold about our policies, and not just say we're a sanctuary city without actually having teeth to what that means. So I think this year we really push for that in the local level and the state level by pushing our county government and our local LA city government to pass policies that are meaningful, saying that information sharing between local government and ICE will be very limited. We would collect data regarding people's emergency status if not needed, as well as providing funding for legal representation for Angelino's large team. So in the past couple of years, there have been efforts in really moving forward this idea of due process for all, regardless of the immigration status. And I think this year, because of the election and because of the rhetoric we heard from the Trump administration and his campaign around really targeting immigrants and criminalizing immigrants and really kind of not acknowledging the fact that our criminal justice system is flawed and it doesn't work in the way that it should. And when you mix that with immigration justice or the immigration system, it becomes this hot mess of folks basically being punished twice, right? For folks who already served their time, rehabilitated, and then get forwarded to ICE because ICE is literally waiting for them outside the jail or had done an interview with them and is basically transferring over to an ICE agent. So I think for us here in LA, it was about protecting the rights of everyone, and I think it's really protecting the rights of the most marginalized folks in our communities by upholding basic principles of due process and upholding principles of not double punishing people because they're immigrants, right? And in the way our system treats immigrants compared to U.S. citizens are different, right? And I think how are we creating equity and equality in our policies? So in LA County, passing those policies through the Justice Fund, which unfortunately has a carve out. So the LA Justice Fund is a partnership between the city, the county, and private philanthropy to provide legal representation for LA County residents that are detained or legal representation that's currently being distributed through the California Foundation. So that was a big effort that the community here in Los Angeles won and fought so hard for, to make it as universal of a program as possible, meaning anyone that comes through a door should be able to get an access to a lawyer, right? But the fact is, 68% of the immigrants and I think California do not have legal representation. So I think that's kind of the fact and figures that we're coming from, and the reality is that immigrants face different barriers, language barrier, and not understanding the immigration system, right? Like for you to expect someone to represent themselves in front of an immigration judge, one that's cruel, inhumane, immoral, because you're basically like feeding someone to the dogs without having the instruction. So for us at Asian Americans Organizing Justice LA and our partners in the county of Los Angeles, we made it a priority to ensure that those policies move forward, understanding the complexities of people's lives, that you should not judge someone by the worst mistake in their lives, right? That should not be the color of the future, right? Like you should be able to look at someone's life holistically and really understand that these people are part of families, are part of communities, and that really this is about public safety and about protecting our communities and communities, because when immigrant communities or Angelinos generally have, everyone here probably knows an immigrant, right? Have immigrant families, are close to immigrants. I think when immigrants are able to trust the law enforcement because they view them as having this entangled relationship with ICE, feeling that they can't report crimes, that makes us less safe in the city and less safe like county. And I think that's the argument we've made both locally and statewide on the bills that we move forward in the state. So folks are probably familiar with the bill that's moving forward right now. That's about to be voted on in the next couple hours. SB 54, the California Values Act, which is going to be the strongest pro-immigrant policy we've seen in the nation, right? Which really saying that California is not going to funnel local and state resources into the deportation machine that we see today. And one thing I want to mention is this deportation machine was not made by the Trump administration, it was made by the Obama administration, but this administration decided to put it on steroids. And I think it's really about the pieces around that, and also creating policies where we're creating safe zones for immigrant communities and all Californians, regardless of immigration status, to have access to school, to have access to courthouses, libraries, and a slew of different entities that folks access on a day-to-day basis. But the fear is so real because we've seen ICE's rogue tactic of waiting outside the school to pick up a parent, or roaming the courts of Los Angeles, or even the fact that there is data sharing happening between our state and local government with the federal government, and how are we really mitigating those? So I think in terms of sanctuary policies for us, it's about being holistic in the way we view it, and really moving forward policies that aren't just monolithic, because Angelinos are very dynamic people, right? We carry different identities, we live different gendered lives, racialized lives, and I think those play in different particular ways. And I think the one thing that at least we're very intentional about doing in the coalition that we're part of, which is the ICLU coalition, the Los Angeles County Universal Reciprocity Coalition, is about being intersectional in our approach, and really the term sanctuary should not just be for immigrants, it's for everyone that lives in Los Angeles, right? Whether you're a street vendor, whether you're an LGBT person or a Black person, because all those identities intersect and interplay in the way we interact with our local systems and our local policies. So I think pushing that forward has been really difficult because I think the term sanctuary is so associated with different communities that when you talk about, hey, let's make sure the street vending is not criminalized, so like people who are actually selling it don't get a ticket and aren't flagged for any misdemeanors or whatnot, right? Because that makes you more susceptible to ICE, because basically, right, they prioritize folks with any type of conviction, whether you see them like a DUI or a old busted ticket, a traffic ticket, right? Like, those are things that we've seen in the past couple of years. So I think really trying to look at the micro level of it and seeing like what does that look like on a day-to-day basis for people's lives. And I think that's why statewide we're trying to push for the California Values Act, because we know there is an inconsistent way police is interacting with ICE, the way they're asking people's immigration status, or the way they're interacting with the community. So I think for us, it's very critical to think about the sanctuary movement, both nationally, locally, and statewide, because it does have impact on the way we talk about it, right? When we talk about a particular segment of these policies, we leave out other important pieces, right? I think an important piece of having a sanctuary city is also having culturally competent services and information to the diverse communities that live in Los Angeles. And I think a great example that I've seen is in the city of New York, where really they're calling their city like a freedom city rather than a sanctuary city, because I think they're trying to expand on the ideology of what sanctuary cities are. And also, I think sanctuary comes in different ways, whether it's creating space for folks who are invisibilized within our communities. I think that's the work we've done at Advancing Justice and our other Asian Americans and Hispanic partners, is create visibility for our communities and really acknowledge there are undocumented Asian Americans in our state, in our localities, nationally, and what does that mean for folks when we talk about immigration policy and sanctuary policies? Because often, right, just because of the mere fact that Mexicans have a large population of immigrants, I think the demographic scheme, you get overshadowed, and I think there's so much different needs in different communities that we have to be mindful of those different groups and and coalition building is such an important aspect of the work in order to understand what is a more holistic policy that we're moving forward, both at every level of the government. And I think just really understanding the fact that we need to hold our elected officials accountable. And the way they talk about our communities, they talk about the policies that are moving forward, right? That it doesn't demonize the rest of the community. I think that if politicians tend to pick a specific segment of the community and focus on that particular population and then leave everyone else, right? As if they're not part of those families, those communities. I think in LA County we have a very unique situation where Older Sheriff McDonald is moving forward in a headstrong opposition to the California Values Act, regardless of the fact that the community here in LA says, no, you should not be working with ICE in the way that you are, and the way that he's talked about it is very untruthful. And the fact that he kept saying the people that get transferred to ICE are like serious convicted criminals who do X, Y, and Z, and the fact that their data even says it, that 50% of the transfer between the sheriff's department and LA County and ICE have been mostly folks who are actually eligible for Prop 47. And then 30.5% of those are actually nonviolent drug convictions, and then 19.4% are like property offenses. And these are not the folks that he kept mentioning in the media interviews that he's doing, right? Like these are like the drug dealers, the killers, etc. And I think it's the way the topic has been, and I think we need to make sure that we're unraveling the truth of the way our other officials are talking about the community, because it does impact how feasible it is to move forward policies. So I'm going to end on that part.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to both of you. Sean, it's so interesting to think about the parallels between today and in the 80s, in particular the dynamics between the federal government and some of our state and local leaders. Just this last week, the City Council adopted a resolution declaring LA a city of sanctuary, not a sanctuary city, a city of sanctuary, but we can try to chew on that for a little bit, but it was very much a response to the DACA announcement from last week. So I'm going to echo a lot of what Anthony said, which is probably not surprising because we work together on lots of stuff. But I wanted to talk a little bit, I thought it would be helpful to use Special Order 40 as a sort of case study to think about some of these sanctuary issues. Are folks familiar with what Special Order 40 is? So this is an LAPD policy that was initially adopted in 1979 under Chief Gerald Gates at the time. And it's taken on a somewhat like mythic quality, but it's actually pretty limited in what it provides. The only kind of substantive protection it provides is it says that LAPD officers won't instigate an investigation into somebody's immigration status, like on their own. But it doesn't otherwise limit LAPD's ability to cooperate with ICE or take actions that might make somebody more vulnerable to deportation. Nonetheless, it's considered a landmark policy. It was ahead of its time in 1979, and it's taken on this mythic quality because I think it really embodies a philosophy that LAPD has subscribed to since that time, and other law enforcement agencies have adopted as well. And there's kind of like two threads, I think, of thinking behind it. One is just this embracing of a community policing model that, you know, is a recognition that LA is an incredibly diverse community, very large immigrant populations here, and as Anthony was saying, you can't do effective policing in that kind of community if a large segment of the population distrusts you because they think if they interact with you, it might lead to their deportation. So there's a sort of practical aspect to this. I think there's also a moral aspect to it as well, and this reflects the time that it was adopted and continues today, that LAPD leadership and city leaders didn't want to be party to the types of immigration enforcement that they saw the federal government engaging in at the time. You know, particularly as a community with so many immigrant families here, you see parents torn away from children, children torn away from parents, communities torn apart by deportations, and LAPD was largely saying, we don't think that makes our community safer, and we don't want to be complicit in those kinds of activities. But Special Order 40 is very much a relic of its time, and not only because it's very limited, but if you just like look at the terms of it, it refers to INS, which has existed for over a decade. It uses terms that LAPD doesn't use anymore, like illegal alien. And I think the most glaring thing is a cursor in there that refers to a teletype machine that they're supposed to use. There's a process going on right now with LAPD to update that policy, not only to fix some of these terminology things, but also to change LAPD's policies to reflect the changes in immigration enforcement that we've seen in the last 40 years. So I just want to briefly touch on some of those things. So there's been sort of two large-scale changes in the way immigration enforcement happens. One is that, as Anthony was alluding to, now ICE uses the criminal justice system as one of the major ways that they're able to identify and apprehend people for deportation. So this happens when you get booked into custody by LAPD or the sheriffs, they fingerprint you, and your fingerprints go to a county database. That database is hooked up to the FBI database, and that's for good reason. I think county and LAPD officials want to know if there's an outstanding warrant out there and you're wanted in another jurisdiction. But the FBI database is hooked up to ICE's database. And so now ICE knows every single person that gets booked into custody. If they have a record of you previously being in the country and being deported, if they have a record that might indicate that you've overstayed, or they have some other reason to think that they might want to investigate further or put you in deportation proceedings, they issue what's known as a detainer to LAPD or the Sheriff's Department, saying essentially, hold this person, even if they're being set to be released, hold them for longer so we can come and pick them up and put them in proceedings, or at least interrogate them. At the minimum, they ask that local law enforcement agencies notify them when they're going to release the person so they can sit outside in front of the jail and pick them up as people are released. ICE also relies heavily on what's known as 287G agreements. Those are agreements between local law enforcement agencies and ICE that either allow ICE to sit in the jails and conduct interviews with people that are there, or deputize local law enforcement agents to exercise the powers of federal immigration agents. Sheriff Arpaio is, I think, the most infamous example of a local law enforcement agency that we're giving those powers and abuse them. And we know that the Trump administration wants to grow this types of collaboration. The other bigger change that we've seen is just the sheer amount of information that's maintained by state and local governments that, if it was found into the hands of immigration agents, could lead to someone's deportation. Things like DMV records, utility bills, fingerprinting databases, school records. All of these things are things that ICE already tries to get a hold of to help them either often to identify where someone's living if they're looking for them, or just find out more information about them. So there's real information security issues that have arisen as a result of the changing enforcement practices. And I do want to echo what Anthony said. These changes were really pioneered by the Obama administration, and by the end of it, were really being used on a very large scale. What we're seeing, I think, in the Trump administration is what limited protections and discretion exists in the system at the time is basically being removed. So now it's all no holds barred. But it's really nothing different in kind than what we saw before. It's really just enforcement on steroids. So what we've been doing in response to those changes, there's been some defensive work. That's been policies like SB 54, where we're trying to sever the link between local law enforcement and immigration agents. And those same types of policies we're pushing for at the local level through updating at Special Order 40 and in other local communities around Southern California. We have things like the Justice Funds to provide representation to people in proceedings. A bunch of nonprofits have also gotten together and organized rates response networks so we can provide pro bono assistance for people who get swept up and put in proceedings. But the sanctuary movement, I think, has brought in some ways where it's not just about these defensive measures, it's also about affirmative policies that will allow people to better integrate and embrace our immigrant community members. So things like driver's licenses for undocumented residents, in-state tuition, even things like our street vending, where we're making sure that our enforcement mechanisms don't disproportionately target immigrant workers who may not be able to enter the formal economy. The other set of stuff that we're doing at the ACLU is litigation related. So we've brought lawsuits challenging the way in which ICE issues those detainers, and then if a county honors them and holds somebody, challenge counties for doing that, basically because the detainers, when they're issued, we don't believe are supported by probable cause, which is required by the Fourth Amendment. So we have a case here in LA District Court where we're challenging both LA counties, they don't currently run it as they used to, challenging their practice, and then also ICE's practice, the way they issue those containers. There's also, I think folks know, there are these lawsuits that have been filed across the country, but in California and San Francisco, challenging the Trump administration's threat to withdraw funding for certain federal funding streams to cities that they believe are sanctuary cities, whatever that means. So LA City is a part of the lawsuits, and a bunch of the nonprofits, we've intervened in those cases to support those efforts and make clear that the Trump administration can't coerce state and local governments into doing their duties, immigration enforcement, on threat of pulling funding. So that's really close up there.
Great, thank you. So I guess we'll open it up to audience questions. Yeah.
I was just wondering if, at least at the local level, has there been any impact regarding like gang injunctions and how things like that are used to allow collaboration between ICE and the LAPD, or for ICE to use those kinds of like kind of piggyback on that when these kind of raids happen?
Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of complications that arise between allegations of gang involvement, whether it's through a gang injunction or just general allegations of involvement in the criminal justice system, and then what happens to people in the immigration system. So there are very little protections for people under gang injunctions, and whatever minimal protections there don't exist at all in the immigration system. So any allegation whatsoever is used by an immigration agency to initiate proceedings. We see commonly people denied release on bond because of an allegation that they may be in a gang. We have actually a lawsuit, our Northern California affiliate filed recently about kids that are being re-detained, released to be back with family members while their asylum candidates are being adjudicated, but on the mere allegation that there's some gang involvement, are being put in secure facilities again. And these are kids we're talking about. Again, just the mere allegation, they're giving no opportunity to contest that. I'll share one example that I think is illustrative of some of the things that Anthony was raising before. We have a client from a case that we're actually using to challenge some of the bond procedures in immigration court, but she's a longtime LA resident, lives in South LA, went to a friend's house, to a friend's apartment one morning. At that time, LAPD and ICE conducted a joint raid looking for suspected gang members who they thought were undocumented. They didn't find the person they were looking for, but they did find our client. They ended up interrogating her. She admitted that she didn't have status, so they arrested her and put her in proceedings. She's lived in the United States for decades. She's a grandmother and mother to U.S. citizen children. The only conviction she's ever had in her life is that she was convicted for shoplifting like a decade ago because she stole clothing from Kmart to pay for because she couldn't pay for her kids like new clothing for school. Anyway, at her bond hearing, ICE used the fact that she was in a location where there were suspected gang members living to allege that she had some gang involvement. And they said, look, you live in a neighborhood that there are lots of gangs, and you've been seen interacting with people who are suspected to be in a gang, and that's a good enough reason to believe that you're a gang member and to deny you release. And the judge, although he didn't buy it entirely, set a $60,000 bond in her case because she thought she was a little bit too risky given those allegations of gang involvement. So that's just one example where we see this every day. There's no real protections for people. Once that allegation is a target allegation, they remove the challenge.
Yes, I'm a school board member of Pasadena Schools, and we did pass a resolution saying that our schools will be safe zones, and we will do everything we can to protect our students and their families. But I'm wondering, is there anything formal in place that says that schools, hospitals, courthouses are safe zones? Is there any legal basis for that, or are we just reassuring people?
So that's going to be when SB is passed. You said they were there that in general of California to create policies to the fullest extent of the law to ensure that those particular spaces are safe zones. So like creating protocols in case ICE does come into the school or the courthouses and the hospital, so the employees know what to do. Aside from like, oh, ICE is here, what do we do? Like to just let them roam the courthouses. So they'll basically tell them, take them to a specific group, make them talk to X, Y, and Z. Like those kind of specific instructions are what's gonna come out of SB4 once the conversation with the Attorney General's office happens. Once the governor signs it, before she signs it.
Could you guys talk a little bit about, I know that SB 54 is now a compromised version, and so what, what limitations there are now in that bill, what provisions have been taken out?
I don't remember like all the changes that happened. So I think the biggest changes was around, I think right now, what's in the bill is using this Trust Act as a standard, but a little more expanded. A lot of the protections are only for local jails, not much for the state jails. But I think the one thing that we were able to get was enforcing the Truth and Trust Act in the state jails where before it was not implemented. I think there's a lot of good cases of 54. For example, California can no longer, in any county in California can no longer get into a 270 agreement. And the only county that's doing that still is Orange County. It also prohibits local law enforcement to ask for misinformation status. And I think there's so many different components to it. That's kind of hard for me to go for what I want right now. But yeah. But I think it is still the strongest bill out there for urban communities. And I think a complementary bill to that related to schools is a bill that we're working on, AB 699, with Senator O'Donnell, which basically is reaffirming the rights of immigrants to go to K-12 education system. So clarity bill being reaffirmed and actually creating policies for the schools. And there's other different bills that are complementary to 54. So I think the way we're looking at it is 54 on top of AB 699 on top of the other immigration-related bills that are going to provide protection for immigrant communities. So I know there was a bill regarding landlords not being able to use someone's immigration status against them and import them to IA. So those are like concrete policies that are complementary to this bigger bill that's been more discussed in the public arena.
I think like this relates also to what Anthony was talking before about the justice fund, is that we've seen this week before they carved out certain protections for certain people based on if they've been convicted of certain crimes. And from our perspective, like everybody's entitled to due process and without exception or carve out. And so it's been very disappointing to see even allies of the legislature subscribe to this narrative. Like there are some immigrants that are deserving of due process and there's some that aren't. So that's been challenging.
So I kind of am interested in sort of historical comparison between the other movement and what's going on now. And so obviously faith-based communities were really at the forefront of the sanctuary movement that you talked about. And I think, today, I mean, luckily we have like CLU and other organizations, but I'm just wondering if you might speculate on, what the differences are in terms of what's going on vis-a-vis the relative importance of faith-based organizations versus other.
Absolutely, yeah. I have a few thoughts and theories on that. One is, as I mentioned in my presentation, was in the 1980s, I think the churches saw the sanctuary movement as a sort of straightforward response to a refugee crisis, which they had been queued up to be on board with really since World War II. So I think that, like I said, it made it relatively uncontroversial, even among religious figures that weren't necessarily all that progressive in either their religious or political points of view, because it's just the mainstream kind of, especially Christian churches and mainstream Jewish organizations were sort of all on board with that issue. So I think that's one difference, is that this is perhaps not as right down the middle of the bowling lane as that was. The other thing is, I think, jumping off from the experience of the 1980s, I think there might be a little more institutional skittishness about what does sanctuary mean. How does it affect institutions that are church affiliated but not churches? We have this issue as a Catholic university. Does this mean, what about our federal funding, and what about, do we shelter our employees, and what does that mean? So I think there has been more thinking, and therefore too much caution, in my humble opinion, but there is a more cautious approach. And then the other one is, frankly, somewhat demographic, and I'm not sure how much validity there is to this, but I would say that to some degree, the average churchgoer, especially in the Christian churches these days, those that are still active in the churches tend to be more conservative politically today than they were in the 1980s. I think a lot of the more progressive religious voices have migrated into secular activism over time. So those would be my three theories.
Yeah, Father Dempsey, you might be the right next person to ask it, how are all the issues and the policies that came out of the Vietnamese era, the Vietnamese boat people, being applied or considered today, or are they?
Yeah, once again, I think that's a refugee issue. One of the things that I didn't draw out as fully in my presentation was that the Reagan administration did not want to, for political reasons, consider the Central American refugees to be true refugees. They explicitly said they're coming for economic reasons, and the United States has no obligation to welcome people coming for economic reasons. Of course, the United States had a history of welcoming people when it felt like these were people that were our political allies, and the boat people would be some of them and many others over the years. So I think there's a way in which who is a refugee is a political framing, and I think one parallel between the 1980s, which I was describing, and now is that especially the federal administration is not going to define many groups as true political refugees worthy of asylum.
Whereas they did the boat people, they considered them or treated them as true refugees?
That was a program, I think, not worked out until 1980. But then the federal government did provide a legal means for them to come and to be settled in certain parts of the country, and they correspond to the parts of the country that have significant Vietnamese and Hmong communities today. Minneapolis, Houston, here in California, there's a few around the country. But yeah, that's a 1980, I believe, program.
Lily?
Thank you for the brief there. This has been really interesting and informative. I was struck, particularly in the last two presentations, a sort of frustration with the term sanctuary, or some this kind of, irritation is the right word. And I was just wondering if you see that as actually a term that's limiting certain kinds of activism or action. Is it a useful term, or is it actually sort of preventing various different actions from taking hold? And I think that also to Sean, I mean, how has it been a useful sort of category of historical analysis, or is it kind of preventing certain questions from being asked?
I think the term sanctuary itself, it does create that human connection with folks, that people understand what it means. But I think in terms of what it does, I think it often creates a false narrative, right? Like, oh, everyone's going to be safe. When the fact is, not everyone's going to be covered by the policies that are being pushed forward. So I think, like, how do you play that fine line between using that term and being realistic to folks of like, actually it's about like limiting who gets captured or detained by ICE, right? And actually it's trying to provide as much protection to people as possible. And I think often we use the term sanctuary because it's the more it's easier to use because people know what it is, have a certain understanding of it, than having to come up with a new terminology. But I think there are folks who are forging different terminology. So I've heard of welcoming cities, freedom cities. So I think it really does capture a more localized characteristic of the policies they're trying to move forward, or like kind of the framework that they want to move forward. So.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think the challenge is just that there is this rich history with sanctuary, and so it has that foundation. We don't want to totally lose the connection, but I do think there is this understanding that it is a sort of defensive posture, and that's not the message that we want to send, or the policies necessarily that we want to adopt are all defensive in nature. So.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that the history of the original sanctuary movement is useful, but it's also, history can be constraining as well. And so I think, you know, we're facing a very different context these days, and I think the idea of sanctuary was sort of on the shelf and was able to be sort of initially deployed. But I think we are running up against some of the limits of that term and even of that